we are not just victims of these systems. We are also participants in them. The algorithm has decided you are guilty of something. We lose track of who we are beneath the roles we play. What would happen if I stopped trying to prove my innocence and simply lived my life? Someone must have been spreading lies about Joseph K. For without having done anything particularly wrong, he was arrested one fine morning. This is how Franz Kafka begins the trial, published in 1925, a year after his one sentence, and suddenly we are thrown into a nightmare that feels strangely familiar. Because haven't we all felt this way at some point? That creeping sense that we are being judged for something we can't name, accused of crimes we don't remember committing. And what if I told you that you are living in the trial right now? That the anxiety you feel scrolling through social media, the way you second guess yourselves in meetings, the constant sense that you are not quite measuring up to invisible standards. What if all of that is just a modern version of Joseph K's predicament? Today we are going to explore how Kafka's masterpiece isn't just a surreal story from 100 years ago. It's a mirror held up to our modern condition, reflecting back the guilt we carry without knowing why, the system that judges us without explanation, and the strange way we lose ourselves in the process of trying to prove our innocence. Before we dive deep into the trial, let's talk about the man who wrote it. Franz Kafka lived from 1883 to 1924 in Prague, which was then part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. He was caught between worlds: Jewish in a predominantly Christian society, German-speaking in a Czech city, working a day job at an insurance company while dreaming of big literature. Kafka understood what it meant to feel like an outsider, to never quite belong. So he worked for the Workers' Accident Insurance Institute, where he processed claims and investigated workplace injuries. Every day he saw how bureaucratic systems could crush individual human beings and how people could get lost in paperwork and procedures that seemed designed to exhaust rather than help. But here is what makes Kafka truly remarkable. He took that personal experience of alienation and bureaucratic absurdity and turned it into something universal. The word Kafkaesque entered our language because his vision of modern life, impersonal, absurd, anxiety-inducing, resonated so deeply with so many people. When Kafka wrote The Trial, he was already sick with the tuberculosis that would kill him at 40. He never finished the novel, and he asked his friend Max Brod to burn all his unpublished work. Thank goodness Brod didn't listen, because what Kafka captured in The Trial was something essential about the human condition in the modern world. So what happens in The Trial? Joseph K., a bank clerk, wakes up one morning to find two men in his room who tell him he's under arrest. But they won't tell him what crime he's supposed to have committed. They don't even take him to jail. Instead, they tell him his case is now proceeding and he must report to court hearings in strange, hidden rooms throughout the city. K becomes obsessed with his case. He hires lawyers, seeks help from women connected to the court, tries everything he can think of to clear his name. But the more he engages with the legal system, the more confused and guilty he feels. No one will explain the charges. No one will tell him how to defend himself. The process itself becomes the punishment. This is the Kafkaesque condition, being trapped in a system that demands your participation but refuses to explain its rules. It's the anxiety of being judged by standards you can't access, accused of transgressions you can't identify. Just think about the last time you felt that stomach-dropping sensation when your boss asked to speak with you, even though you couldn't think of anything you'd done wrong. Or the way your heart races when you see a police car behind you on the highway, even when you are driving the speed limit. That's the Kafkaesque condition. We have internalized a sense of guilt that exists independent of any actual wrongdoing. The philosopher Walter Benjamin wrote about how Kafka's characters are always guilty of something, but never of what they are accused of. We carry guilt, not because we have done something wrong, but because existing in modern society means constantly failing to live up to impossible, invisible standards. Now let's pull back the curtain and look at how the trial reflects our current reality. Because if Joseph K's story feels familiar, it's because we are living versions of it every day. Think about social media. You post something innocent, maybe a photo of your lunch or a casual observation about the weather. Suddenly, you are being criticized by strangers who have taken your words out of context, who seem to know exactly what you meant better than you do. You try to explain, to defend yourself, but every response only makes things worse. The algorithm has decided you're guilty of something, like bad taste, poor judgment, insufficient awareness, and there is no court of appeals. Or consider the modern workplace. You have evaluated on metrics you don't fully understand by managers who may never directly observe your work. Your performance review includes feedback about areas of improvement that feel vague and impossible to address. You're told you need to be more strategic or show better leadership presence. But no one can explain exactly what that means or how to achieve it. Even in our personal relationships, we often find ourselves defending against accusations we don't understand. Always do this, for example, someone says. But when you ask what this is, the conversation spirals into an argument about your inability to see your own patterns. No, that's not my experience. You become guilty not of a specific action, but of lacking the self-awareness to recognize your guilt. The trial shows us how modern systems, bureaucratic, technological, social, have a way of making us feel perpetually inadequate without ever clearly stating their expectations. We are all Joseph K, wandering through institutions that claim to serve us while systematically eroding our sense of agency and self-worth. Here's where things get truly interesting and truly painful. As Joseph K becomes more involved with his case, something strange happens to him. He begins to believe he must be guilty of something. After all, why else would this elaborate system exist? Why else would so many people be involved in prosecuting him? This is what psychologists call internalized guilt, the way we absorb the judgments of systems and institutions until they become part of our inner dialogue. Carl Jung wrote about how we often carry collective guilt, feeling responsible for things we had no hand in creating. Kafka understood this intuitively. When we are constantly being evaluated, measured, and found wanting by invisible standards, we start to believe there must be something fundamentally wrong with us. We begin to monitor ourselves, to become our own prosecutors. We develop what the psychologist David Riesman called other-directedness, a personality structure organized around the perceived expectations of others rather than our own values and desires. The cruelest part of the trial is how K's engagement with the legal system transforms him. At the beginning, he's indignant, certain of his innocence. But by the end, he has internalized the logic of his guilt so completely that when two men come to execute him, he doesn't resist. He has learned to see himself through the system's eyes. This is happening to us all the time. We internalize the guilt projected onto us by systems that benefit from our self-doubt. The endless cycle of self-improvement promises that with enough work, enough optimization, enough awareness, we can finally become acceptable. But the standards keep shifting. The goalposts keep moving and we exhaust ourselves, chasing approval from judges whose faces we never see. And perhaps the most haunting aspect of the trial is how Joseph K gradually disappears as a person. At the beginning of the novel, we know a little about him. He works at a bank, he has a landlady, he visits a woman named Elsa on Sunday evenings. But as the story progresses, these details fade away. K becomes nothing but his case, nothing but his attempt to prove his innocence. This is what happens when we define ourselves entirely in relation to external judgment. We lose track of who we are beneath the roles we play, the image we are trying to project, the person we think we should be. The self becomes invisible, even to itself. And surely I have to say a word about Jean-Paul Sartre in this context. So one of the most famous existentialists, who wrote about how we often exist in bad faith, defining ourselves through the eyes of others, rather than taking responsibility for our own existence. Kafka shows us what this looks like in practice. The slow erasure of the self through constant self-surveillance and attempts to anticipate judgment. When we are always trying to prove we are not guilty of some unnamed crime, we forget to ask, who are we when we are not being judged? What do we want when we are not trying to want the right things? What would we do if we weren't afraid of being wrong? The trial suggests that this might be the real tragedy of modern life. Not that we are judged unfairly, but that we disappear in the process of trying to prove our worth to systems that were never designed to see us as we are. So here's an uncomfortable truth that Kafka forces us to confront. We are not just victims of these systems. We are also participants in them. We judge others the same way we fear being judged. We create the very conditions that make us feel guilty and afraid. Think about how quickly we form opinions about people based on limited information. How readily we assume we understand someone's motivations from a single social media post or a brief interaction. How often we participate in the kind of vague systemic judgment that makes others feel the way Joseph K. feels. The philosopher Hannah Arendt wrote about the banality of evil, how ordinary people become complicit in harmful systems simply by following rules and fulfilling roles without questioning their larger purpose. Kafka shows us a gentler version of this. The banality of judgment, the way we all participate in creating the very conditions that make us feel perpetually guilty and inadequate. And this isn't to blame ourselves, but to recognize our own agency. If we are all living in versions of the trial, we also all have the power to step out of our roles as both judges and accused. We can choose to see others with the same complexity and compassion we hope to receive. Okay, so how to break the cycle? How to escape the matrix, this Kafkaesque trap? How do we stop living like Joseph K., always defending ourselves against charges we don't understand? The first step might be recognizing that the guilt is often not about anything real. When you feel that familiar anxiety, that sense that you are not measuring up, pause and ask, measuring up to what exactly? Whose standards am I trying to meet? What would happen if I stopped trying to prove my innocence and simply lived my life? The second step is learning to distinguish between legitimate feedback and systemic pressure. Sometimes criticism is valid and helpful, but often the vague sense that we are not good enough comes from systems designed to keep us anxious and compliant. Learning to tell the difference is a crucial life skill. The first step that I propose is remembering that you exist independent of others' judgments. You are not your performance review, your social media engagement, your grades, your productive metrics. You are a human being with inherent worth that doesn't need to be earned or proven. This surely doesn't mean becoming indifferent to others or rejecting all forms of accountability, because responsibility is a very important sphere of our lives. It means developing what the psychologist Viktor Frankl called the last of human freedoms. The freedom to choose your response to any situation, including the situation of being judged. But maybe the real question the trial asks isn't how we escape judgment, but how to live authentically in the face of it. Because the systems that made Joseph K. feel guilty aren't going anywhere. Bureaucracy, social pressure, the endless demand to optimize, to grow and improve. These are features of modern life, not bugs. The deeper wisdom might be learning to carry our guilt lightly, to recognize it as information about the world we live in, rather than truth about who we are. To develop what Kafka himself seemed to possess, the ability to see the absurdity clearly, without letting it destroy our capacity for compassion, creativity, and connection with others. In his diaries, Kafka wrote, "A book must be the axe for the frozen sea inside us." The trial is that kind of axe. Not because it provides easy answers, but because it breaks through our comfortable assumptions about fairness, justice, and self-worth. It shows us how we have been living and asks whether we want to continue. The trial doesn't end with Joseph K.'s vindication or his definitive condemnation. It ends with his executed by functionaries who seem as confused about the process as he was. But maybe that's the point of it. Maybe the question isn't whether we are guilty or innocent, but whether we can learn to live fully in the space of not knowing. This is what makes Kafka's work so relevant today. We live in an age of infinite information, but limited wisdom. Constant connection, but deep loneliness. Endless options, but persistent anxiety. Like Joseph K., we are all trying to navigate systems that seem designed to confuse rather than clarify, to judge rather than understand. But here is what Joseph K. never quite learned and what we can. The system's opinion of us is not the final word. We can choose to engage with judgment, our own and others, as information rather than truth. We can learn to see ourselves with the same complexity and compassion we offer our closest friends. The trial reminds us that guilt, like beauty, is often in the eye of the beholder. And sometimes the most radical thing we can do is simply refuse to accept someone else's verdict on our own worth. So Joseph K. is executed at the end of the novel. But there is also one more figure in this scene, in this final scene of the novel. There is one mysterious figure that K spots in the window of the building that observes his execution. And perhaps you are that person. Franz Kafka died at 40, never knowing that his unfinished novel would become one of the most important books of the 20th century. He couldn't have predicted that Kafkaesque would enter our everyday vocabulary, or that his vision of bureaucratic absurdity would feel so prophetic a century later. But maybe he just understood something essential about the human condition that transcends any particular time or place. We are all trying to prove ourselves worthy of a love that cannot be earned, defending ourselves against accusations that cannot be answered, seeking approval from judges whose standards we cannot know. The trial doesn't offer us a way out of this predicament, but it does offer us something equally valuable: the recognition that we are not alone in it, that the anxiety you feel, the guilt you carry, the sense that you are always falling short, these are not personal failings, but shared human experiences. And maybe that's enough. Maybe knowing that we are all Joseph K., all wandering through systems that don't quite make sense, can help us treat each other with a little more kindness, a little more understanding, and a little more grace. The question isn't whether you are guilty or innocent. The question is whether you can learn to see yourself and others as beautifully, messily, and inevitably human. And speaking of finding our way through confusion and uncertainty, there's another question that haunts many of us. Not just am I guilty, but what am I supposed to be doing with my life? Søren Kierkegaard, the Danish philosopher, spent his entire career wrestling with this question of calling and purpose in a world that often seems meaningless. If you have ever felt lost about your direction in life, if you have ever wondered whether you are living authentically or just following someone else's script, you might find his insights surprisingly relevant. I've explored Kierkegaard's radical ideas about finding your true calling in modern life. You can watch that video right here. And for now, until next time, be gentle with yourself. You are doing better than you know. If you enjoyed this video, remember about the possibility of leaving me a like and a subscription if you want to see more content like this somewhere in the future. The comment section is for you if you have any doubts or questions. And for now, thank you for watching. Goodbye.